Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to talk a bit on some follow-up work on the key reinstallation attack against WPA2. So while I'm giving this presentation, there are, I would say, two main takeaways to keep in mind. The first one is very specific about this contribution, namely that avoiding key reinstallations in Wi-Fi appear to be a lot trickier than we initially assumed. And the second takeaway is, I believe, a bit more general, and that's that if you have a protocol, either an implementation or a specification of a protocol, and you discover a certain bug in it, it can be very difficult in practice to determine whether this bug is exploitable in practice or not. Because a lot of times, in order to exploit some weird behavior, you need to force the client into some specific state where it accepts either a malformed packet or certain parameters. And in this presentation, you will see some clever tricks that we had to use to force this situation where it does become exploitable. So first, a quick background. How did key reinstallation against WPA2 work? So I'm going to illustrate the high-level idea by explaining it against the four-way handshake of WPA2. And the first question that you may have if you're not familiar with Wi-Fi is, what is this four-way handshake? And briefly summarized, the four-way handshake provides two main things. The first one, it provides mutual authentication, meaning the client proves that it possesses the correct credentials to connect to the network, and the client also authenticates the access point. At the same time, this handshake generates a fresh session key called the PTK, and this PTK will be used after the four-way handshake to encrypt and authenticate data packets that are sent over the network. So this four-way handshake is used both in your ordinary home network, but also on enterprise networks like Ethereum, for example. So let's get back to how the session key is used after the four-way handshake. In other words, how is data being encrypted? So this construction at a high level is very simple. We have our plaintext data that we want to encrypt. We take our session key and we combine it with a packet number that is always incremented by 1. And this packet number is also called a nonce. And the idea is then by mixing the session key with this unique packet number, we end up with a unique per packet key. And this per packet key is then used to encrypt the data frame. And this is quite straightforward, independent of how exactly your Wi-Fi network is configured. It uses a stream cipher to generate some key stream that's stored with the plaintext to derive your ciphertext. Plaintext header is added as well, so the receiver knows what to do with the packet. But this construction is quite straightforward, as you can see. And of course, here we rely on one very important assumption, and that's that this packet number, this nonce, is only used once under a specific session key. Because otherwise, if you reuse a nonce, well, in that case, you're going to reuse the per packet key, which means you're going to reuse keystream. And as we all know here, I hope if you reuse keystream, you're in a bad position, because in general, that means you can start decrypting data that is being transmitted. So the big question here now is this packet number indeed ever reused? And the answer is no. That's how we were able to attack it. And I'll now quickly explain how the attack worked. So let's say we have the following scenario where there is a client that wants to connect to the access point here on the right. And there's also an adversary that is present. And this adversary has a man in the middle position. How exactly this man in the middle position is being obtained is not important. But one important thing to note here is that with this man in the middle position, the adversary cannot yet decrypt packets. It's only to reliably manipulate, unblock, and modify packets. Okay, so let's say the adversary has this man in the middle. The client is now trying to connect. If it's an enterprise network like Ethereum, there's first this 802.1x authentication handshake. Luckily, we don't need to know the details about that. The only important thing is that after this handshake, there is some shared secret between the client and the access point. And if you have an ordinary home network, this shared secret is simply the password of the network, so you don't need to execute this handshake. Okay, so we can now assume there is some shared secret, and once we have that, we can start executing the four-way handshake. And as the name of this handshake implies, it consists of 4 messages. And the first 2 are used to transport a random number between both devices. So we can see here, first the access point sends the A nonce to the client, and then the client replies with the S nonce, which stands for supplicant nonce, where supplicant is just a synonym for client. And once both devices have each other's random number, they can combine it with the session key, with the PTK, with the shared secret, to then derive the session key, the PTK. And a bit simplified, the next 2 messages of the handshake are just used to confirm that both parties indeed negotiated the same session key. Now, in the attack here, the adversary is not going to forward message 4 to the access point though. And because of that, we end up in a very interesting scenario, because the client now thinks that the handshake has completed because it received all the messages from the handshake, and it also replied using all the messages. That means it's going to install the session key, and the client may now start sending encrypted data frames. And when it is installing this key, it will set this packet number, this transmit nonce, to 0 as well. Now recall though that the access point didn't receive message 4 of the handshake yet, and it will try to recover from that. And the way it does that is it will simply retransmit message 3 to the client, and then the Wi-Fi specification is quite clear what should be done. The client should reply using a new message 4. Now, interestingly, most implementations will already encrypt this handshake message. Why is that the case? Well, this handshake message is an ordinary data frame. We install the session key, so it's encrypted. So just for now, accept that this is the case. It makes the explanation a bit more simple. The more important remark here is that after the client replied to this retransmitted message 3, the Wi-Fi specification says, okay, whenever you reply using message 4, after that you should install the session key. Which in this case means that the same key is being installed, but this packet number, this nonce, is again reset to 0. And this is where the problem occurs, because if the client now sends another encrypted data frame, it will reuse the nonce value of 1. So now my question is, how can I decrypt this data frame here at the bottom? This diagram contains all the information you need. Well, the answer is simple. We have nonce reuse here. The important observation now is that we have message 4 in plain text, and we have the encrypted version. Now there is a small difference between them, but that difference is not too important. We can simply XOR these 2, and we have the key stream corresponding to a nonce value of 1. And we can use that to decrypt our data packet here. And there you go, we're now decrypting WPA2 traffic. So that's a very brief summary of how the attack works. In practice, when you want to carry out the attack exactly as shown here, you are going to run into a few obstacles though. And the biggest obstacle here is that when the access point retransmits message 3 to the client, then a lot of devices will reject this handshake message. Now, this is actually not according to the specification. According to the specification, this message should be accepted. But here we again have this strange situation where this handshake message is an ordinary data frame. And well, we installed the session key, so in principle, we should only be accepting encrypted data frames. And that's why this retransmitted message 3 is being rejected, because it's plain text. And in our original work, we relied on device-specific race conditions to force the victim to still accept this plain text message. But these were you need to be very careful with the timing. You need to be able to send this retransmitted message 3 fast enough, and it only worked against certain devices, not against all of them. So it was, in practice, it wasn't trivial to make a victim reinstall the session key. And one solution to make this attack more practical is to encrypt message 3. But of course, we can't do that ourselves because, well, we don't have the key. One thing we can do, however, is we can try to trick the access point into sending message 3 in an encrypted fashion. And I'm going to explain how we accomplish that. So this is one of the clever tricks we were able to abuse to make the attacks more practical. And this one is more, it's easier to execute in practice. So how does our technique work? Well, we're going to assume the same situation like just before, like in the original attack. Namely, we have our client, it wants to connect to the access point. We again have a man in the middle here, which is now shown completely on the left. And in this case, we're going to zoom in on the implementation of the access point. We're going to separately look at the kernel, in this case here, the Linux kernel, which implements the encryption of data frames. And we're going to also separately look at the user space, which in the case of Linux is WPA supplicant, which implements the four-way handshake. So to summarize, kernel will encrypt data frames, user space will handle the four-way handshake messages. And the first stage of our attack is exactly the same like I just explained. So the client will try to execute the four-way handshake. We're going to block message 4 from arriving at the access point. But at this point, we're going to do something different. What the adversary is going to do is it's going to forge an empty data frame. And these empty data frames, they are not authenticated. And we're going to set the sleep bit in this frame. So essentially, we're telling the access point, hey, the victim is going to sleep. Meaning the kernel will now queue transmissions towards the client. It will not actually transmit them. That means that after, say, a second, the access point will realize, hey, I haven't received message 4. I need to retransmit message 3. So the user space will tell the kernel, hey, please retransmit message 3 for me. But the kernel will say, wait a second, the client is asleep. I will put this in the queue. And what we now do as an attacker, we don't yet want to wake up the client because then the access point will just send a plain text message 3. So instead, what we will do is we will take this blocked message 4. We will set the sleep bit in the unauthenticated header of the frame. And this causes the Linux kernel to accept this message 4. However, it will not yet mark the client as being awake. The access point thinks it's only awake to transmit the frame, and then it's immediately going back to sleep. So now the kernel will forward this packet to the user space. The user space will now consider, okay, the handshake has completed. It will command the kernel into installing the session key. And maybe you can see where this goes now. We're now simply going to send a plain text data frame to wake up the client. And the kernel will then send the remaining frames that are in the queue. And because by now we installed the session key, well, this message 3 is now encrypted. This means that if the client only accepts encrypted handshake messages, this message 3 is now encrypted, meaning we will now start reusing nonce values so we can have keystream reuse and we can do all our ordinary attacks. Okay, so that is one of the nice contributions of our paper. Another important contribution is that after our disclosure, we studied how the Wi-Fi standard got updated to prevent key reinstallations. And interestingly, their update is very short. It boils down to one line. That's the following here. And basically, this says that if a client or access point is installing a key, and this key is the same as the one that is currently being used, then don't do anything. Don't reset the counters. And this prevents a lot of attacks. However, it doesn't prevent an attack against the installation of the group key. And the group key is used to encrypt and protect broadcast and multicast frames. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here, but basically the group key can be installed by 2 types of frames. And by mixing these types of frames, we can trick the victim into installing the new key. And then we can use the other frame type to reinstall the old key. And then we can bypass this check. And the impact in practice is that we can then replay broadcast and multicast traffic. Now, I really recommend that you check out the paper for how this attack actually works, because there are 3 attack scenarios depending on the order of these handshake messages. But it's a bit too much to explain now. I want to instead explain one other important finding in our paper, and that's that we also studied whether implementations correctly patched against the crack attack. And the first question we had is, what if we would replay message 4 towards the access point? Because recall, in our attack, we replayed message 3 towards the client, and then the Wi-Fi standard is clear. The client should accept or at least process retransmitted message 3s. Retransmitted message 4, they shouldn't be processed. However, we found a certain MediaTek driver which does process replayed or retransmitted message 4s, and this can be used to trigger key reinstallations in the access point. And a lot of devices use this driver that is vulnerable, so in practice, a lot of implementations are affected. And now for the last implementation-specific bug that I will highlight. Again, we also found a few other ones, but this is, I think, another very interesting one. And that's that in the Wi-Fi specification, there is some functionality to refresh the session key. And this is basically done by executing a new 4-way handshake, which consists of exactly the same messages as an original 4-way handshake, except you use a different A nonce and S nonce. Now, what turned out to be the case? macOS properly patched against the crack attack, but then we noticed that the client was reusing the S nonce during a rekey. And they patched that, so that's good. However, this reuse of the S nonce can be abused in practice to also, again, force the client into reinstalling the key. Now, executing this attack in practice is very tricky, because not only do you need to generate an encrypted message 3, you also need to generate an encrypted message 1, which in practice is quite tricky, so it's a tedious attack. Again, for the details, I'm going to refer to the paper, but the summary here is that if a client reuses the S nonce, it's exploitable under specific conditions. So with that, I can conclude the talk. So we made attacks more practical. We were able to bypass the official countermeasure. And one important takeaway here is also that managing group keys is quite tricky in practice. And finally, we need to keep auditing protocols and implementations as well. And I think it might also be interesting to look whether other protocols are vulnerable to these types of attacks. So thank you for your attention.
All right, questions, anybody? We had good questions so far, so I expect some more. So one question from my side. So there are countermeasures that have been proposed by the standardization bodies and have been implemented. I would have expected you to have been perhaps involved in suggesting the countermeasures. Can you say something about the process? Did you try to get involved in proposing the right ones? How do you know they are the right ones? Can you comment on this?
Yeah, so good question. So they indeed asked me for advice on how to defend against that. And I mentioned this this way that we could bypass their suggested countermeasure. And we also have a defense against this new attack, which is now implemented in Android on Linux devices. And I notified the standards body, but they didn't seem to actually fix the standard. So I know one guy got assigned to fixing it, but in the end, I haven't seen any follow-up work that they aren't doing anything about it. Now, I don't know why, My hunch is that they don't consider the attack to be practical enough, or that the impact is too low, because you can only replay broadcast traffic. So maybe they just think, yeah, it's not worth the effort. Let's just keep it like the way it is now. Which to me might mean that maybe in a few years someone will find a very good way to exploit this, and maybe then they will take it seriously, hopefully. But yeah, I don't know why they didn't fix it.
Then last question from me. So if I follow all your suggested countermeasures, will there not be a key reinstallation attack paper anymore?
I don't have any remaining ideas. Now, with this attack against the standard we have now, we have a suggested countermeasure in the paper. But we did not formally analyze this. Now, as far as I know, I haven't been able to come up with any new attacks. But I think it would also be good to model these handshakes and really get some more stronger guarantees.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Another great question.
If I'm not too late. So did you find all of these attacks manually, or did you use a tool to outline them?
These were found manually.
One more question.
Yeah, so how essential is the rekeying to the protocol, or could it be possible to eliminate rekeying from the protocol and come up with something that's more secure?
Well, in this case, the rekeying functionality, in practice, it's actually rarely used. It was mainly used when you had the older WPA TKIP protocol to add some extra security there. So in practice, very few networks use it. And in principle, you could also just kill the connection and just start from scratch, because that would reduce the amount of code, it would reduce the amount of potential bugs. So that might actually be a better solution.
Then you drop your Wi-Fi, right?
Yes. Yeah. But it depends what you want. I mean, if you want dedicated rekey functionality, you do have extra code. So you do have an extra source of potential bugs. So it depends what you want. Do you want performance or security? And you have to balance these two.
All right. And thank you again.